Mr. Bump loses his memory. Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Bump loses his memory. If you would like to read along, please pause the video or mute the audio and read along. Thank you. Mr. Bump was the sort of person who was always having accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, break, crash or drop, he would. When he had his breakfast, he would spill the tea all over the table, and the salt all over his eggs. Poor Mr. Bump. He would have small accidents. When Mr. Bump cleaned the downstairs windows, he would use a small ladder. Crash went the kitchen window as he rested the ladder against it. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump. Then he fell off the ladder. Bump! He would have medium-sized accidents. When he cleaned the upstairs windows, he would use a long ladder. Crash went the living room window as he turned the corner of the path. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again. Crash went the bedroom window as he rested the ladder against it. And he would have big accidents. When his chimney pot came loose in a storm, Mr. Bump decided to fix it. He fetched a very long ladder from his garden shed. Mr. Bump rested the ladder against the wall of his house so he could climb up onto the roof and mend the chimney pot. Crash went the chimney pot. Mr. Bump had lots and lots of accidents. One day, Mr. Bump got out of bed. Or rather, he fell out of bed, as he did every morning. He drew back the curtains and opened the window. It was a beautiful day. He leant on the windowsill, breathed in deeply, and fell out of the window. Bump! Mr. Bump sat up and rubbed his head. And as he rubbed, it dawned on him that he had no idea where he was. He had no idea whose garden he was sitting in. He had no idea whose house he was sitting in front of. And he had no idea who he was. Mr. Bump had lost his memory. Mr. Bump walked up his garden gate and looked down the lane. Mr. Muddle was passing by. "Good afternoon," said Mr. Muddle. And as you and I know, it was morning. But Mr. Muddle, not surprisingly, always gets things in a muddle. "I seem to have lost my memory," said Mr. Bump. "Do you know what my name is?" "You're Mr. Careful," said Mr. Muddle. "Thank you," said Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump went into town. The first person he met was Mrs. Packet the grocer, who was carrying an armful of groceries. "Hello," said Mr. Bump. "I'm Mr. Careful. Can I help?" "Just the person. I need someone careful to deliver these eggs." Mr. Bump took the eggs from Mrs. Packet and set off down the high street. And because he was Mr. Bump, he slipped and fell on the eggs, breaking all of them. Crack! "You're not all that careful, are you?" said Mrs. Packet. "Sorry," said Mr. Bump. He walked on past the dairy. Mr. Bottle, the manager, came out. "I'm looking for someone to drive the milk float," he said. "What's your name?" "Mr. Careful," replied Mr. Bump. "Perfect," said Mr. Bottle. "I need someone careful to deliver the milk. Mr. Bump set off down the road. As he turned the corner, he hit the curb, and the milk float turned over, smashing all the bottles. Smash! "Well, that wasn't very carefully done, was it?" said Mr. Bottle. "Sorry," said Mr. Bump. Then he met Mr. Brush the painter, who was up a ladder painting. "Hello," said Mr. Bump. "I'm Mr. Careful. Do you need a hand?" "Yes, sir, please," replied Mr. Brush. "I need someone careful to pass me my paint pot." Mr. Bump began to climb the ladder, but, being Mr. Bump, he fell off and the pot of paint landed on his head. Splash! Mr. Bump went for a walk. "I don't understand it," he said to himself. "My name is Mr. Careful, but I can't do anything carefully." It was then that he walked into a tree and bumped his head. Bump! An apple fell out of the tree into his hand. "That's odd," he said to himself. "How did I get here? The last thing I remember is opening my bedroom window. And where did all this paint come from?" You know, don't you? Just at that moment Farmer Fields turned up. "Careful!" he called. "That sounds familiar," said Mr. Bump, and he fell down the bank into the river. Thank you for listening.